very formal way to be here, mind you, behind a lectern. But it really is fantastic being back. Even I just said to Phil on the way here, as I drove into one of the main streets coming into Kensington, I had my iPod on, sort of just rambling through the car, and out came Jesus in Your Heart We Find. Now, James recorded that when he left Chevalier Institute so that we could still play that song at this program when he wasn't here anymore. So if you want you know, the top 20 tunes of Spirituality of the Heart, Jesus in Your Heart you find. I've still got it. Anyway, it is really wonderful to be here, and I think I've got the perfect job to marry these topics together today, looking at spirituality of the heart and healing, having come from working with Chevalier Institute, which also was a very healing ministry, to now working in a healthcare environment, which is absolutely focused on healing. So the little intro that was provided, I think, when you were looking at considering perhaps coming along to the program, just said that the way of the heart is a journey to wholeness, and a spirituality of the heart invites us to embrace and integrate all of that and share our woundedness on a healing journey. And quite naturally in our Christian tradition, that it's really through our woundedness, our pain and our suffering, that we share this journey with Jesus, if you like, and then that transformation that is offered then to all humanity. So we had said in Chevalier Institute that healing was definitely the heart's journey, and I suppose that's the essence of this session today. My hope is that we'll have some time, you know, of input. That's the mode of this experience, but have a DVD to show later, and hopefully an opportunity for some personal reflection and sharing as well, because I know it can be quite challenging, particularly in the after lunch zone, to sit and be listening. But while working with Chevalier Institute for the 8.5 years and supporting staff in a professional capacity, I'd say it's a significant part of the work of Chevalier Institute is actually companioning staff, particularly in our colleges, but also the MSC parishes and any other community that we work with, in supporting them on their life's journey. It really didn't matter what program we offered. Essentially, at the heart of it is a person. So even if you're dealing with a maths teacher or a science teacher, you're not just looking at them in that role, you're looking at them in terms of their life journey. And I think the role at Chevalier Institute was essentially about helping people integrate the gifts that a spirituality of the heart had to offer. And I think also that the first movement that Eugene Kaskelly identified in terms of the movement of a spirituality of the heart is going into the core of our being, the depth of our souls, and our own personal needs of love, life and meaning. And that really resonated for me in all the work that we did in the Institute, and it still is the same for the work that I'm doing now. And I'd have to say the most profound experiences companioning people always related to responding to pain, suffering and woundedness, and not necessarily caused by physical issues, even though you may very well in this privileged role that, you know, Phil and Alison now are in, that people would certainly talk about perhaps chronic pain or maybe a cancer diagnosis or a life-threatening illness. But other griefs and hurts that people encountered stem from emotional, psychological, societal and relational and spiritual wounds. And it didn't take long, particularly on our Douglas Park Retreat programs and other programs that we ran, that people would very quickly share very intimate details of their life. So we found that we were really dealing with the whole person, and that was there very profoundly. And having worked now at St. Vincent's, it's nearly 12 months, which I find hard to believe. The 22nd of August is the 12-month anniversary. And I've been involved now in an organisation whose primary focus is responding to physical and psychological, perhaps even societal ailments, reducing and eliminating, if possible, human suffering, but also validating and acknowledging the parallel process of emotional, psychological and societal and spiritual healing that's necessary to companion this. In Catholic healthcare, the phrase "to bring the healing ministry of Jesus to all we serve" is the proclaimed mission statement. And at St. Vincent's, this mission is informed and inspired by the Sisters of Charity. And just talking about the St. John of God communities as well. Like, there are a lot of Catholic congregations that have also moved into healthcare as well as education. And so their founding spirit lives on. as well. But the healing ministry of Christ is really the mantra, if you like, that would go across all of them. But it's such an inspiring mission, and the healing ministry of Jesus, if we looked at the New Testament, is reflected not only in the physical healing offered by Jesus, but the profound impact of healing related to the nature of forgiveness. And equally profound, I'd say, would be that of repairing relationships where isolation due to physical, religious, or the same reasons that I've mentioned before were overcome. So not only now do I witness, say, the impact of someone who's just received a heart-lung transplant or a bone marrow transplant, or the remarkable work of an ED team in responding to the impacts of drug, alcohol, accidents, stabbings, drug overdoses that I've witnessed myself at the front of the hospital, amazing surgical procedures and research, and conditions such as HIV and AIDS that are now no longer a death sentence. I play a part now, a very privileged part, in the healing journey of this on a range of levels, from an administrative one to companioning staff. And even yesterday I ran a whole day experience for what we call staff on 4 North. Everyone's got a ward, and that's they were the staff from Sacred Heart Hospice. And just looking at how they're working together in the profound ministry that they have companioning the dying. You know, one of them shared the other day that, you know, one night they had 3 people, 3 deaths in a night, and just how that the impact of the staff and the families in caring for one another in that is profound. The other side of things, I think, at St Vincent's is that they're really at the forefront of like research in a whole range of ways, but they research at mental health as well. I was actually just thinking of the St Vincent's Private Hospital have just opened a 20-bed unit for young adults with mental health issues, from early diagnosis of perhaps mood disorder through to early psychosis. And it seems, just like Jesus did, and the sisters responded to, say, the AIDS epidemic, they're now looking at what's the current marginalised group that needs support. And young adult mental health was certainly an under-resourced area. And the sisters and the spirited sisters and those that are left here in the organisation now carrying on their mission still live out that mission. And, you know, they've won an award already, and the unit's not even been open for 12 months. So the side of things that I'm inspired by at the moment is the advocacy that happens in relation to issues like homelessness, drug and alcohol. Indigenous health is a high profile at our hospital. But really the essence of responding to the gospel of imperative of justice seems to be there very strongly. In thinking about what I was going to say today, I think I was really challenged to look at the whole notion of the difference between healing and curing. Because in a medical world, we sort of get a sense of we're coming in to be cured, and if we're cured, we're healed. It actually doesn't seem to be the case. Healing and curing are inherently different. Curing, in a way, means probably eliminating all evidence of a disease, while healing means becoming whole. And the bigger meaning, and if I haven't told you, one of the sheets you have in front of you should have quotes that I'll be mostly using. If there's some missing, I can provide them for you at another time. But the bigger meaning of healing is wholing, a filling out of the missing pieces of a person's life, like something, you know, maybe facing death in a more fully realised way. So even if the curative process hasn't happened, the person's still on the journey of healing. And certainly it's an opportunity to come more deeply, as Patricia Rees says here, and fully into life. And this is deeply embedded in Jesus' desire for us in John 10 when he says, I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. A woman, Dr. Christiane Northrup, she's not anyone I've worked with, she's an American woman who's written quite a few books. Women around the room might know her more than the men because women's bodies, women's wisdom, etc. But she talks about the difference between healing and curing, and saying that healing is this natural process that's within the power of everybody. And curing is perhaps what doctors might be called upon to do, or other health professionals, with an external treatment, a medication or a surgical procedure to either mask, and I don't think she means that in a way of just to superficially mask it, but to manage the symptoms or to eliminate them altogether. And sometimes this external treatment doesn't necessarily respond to the factors that contribute to the disease in the first place. So she just acknowledges that healing goes deeper than curing. So I think that's a really important distinction when we're looking at a healing spirituality as well. I'd say I've witnessed at Sacred Heart. I really don't have a lot to do with patients, but when I do, and people tell me stories, you know, you certainly can be healed as you're dying of an incurable disease. You know, and I think that's the gift of what perhaps the staff offer to support people on that healing journey. And I could say from personal experience, I was even thinking about my own life about 12 years ago, my first serious anaphylactic allergic to wheat. And, you know, I was on the way out, basically, and Western medicine saved my life. Less than 24 hours after this incident where I, you know, had an injection straight into my heart to ensure that I would live, I was let out of hospital. And I would say at least 3 months to even get back on my feet. I could not even work for that period of time. Nobody said this might happen to you as a result of this incident or that incident. That anaphylaxis can actually lead to a complete psychosis or, you know, psychological. It's like post-trauma in a way. And, you know, I'm still living with the situation, and while my allergy is not cured, Western medicine at the time certainly cured the immediate presenting problem, but the healing part of that process was a much, much longer process, and one I'm probably still living with today, and that's just a physical condition. And there may very well be, as if any of you have been on a healing journey of any sort, know that, you know, there's other things that impact on our healing journey, and maybe stresses of life that lead to your weaknesses coming to life, if you like. So, yeah, I would say I'm still on that healing journey. So healing's not just a physical phenomenon, it's perhaps above all a psychological and spiritual event. It's not just getting rid of the symptoms of suffering, but it's not just an easy fix. Instead, I would have to say, I think it's an organic process in our entire being. An external agent like medicine or the landscape seen from a window does not produce it. If I had to say one thing about it, I'd say, oh, healing is, and is, well, God, where have I gone through with all of this? Has this been moving or? No. Healing is an inside job. Maybe I didn't do that slide. Okay, not to worry. For example, I mean, you don't have to think too hard when you think about if you've cut your finger. You might disinfect your finger, put a band-aid on it, but where does the healing come from? Within. It comes from within yourself, from within the core of your being. You know, if I feel torn or distressed about something, a friend's warm presence might activate my potentiality for self-generation. So the process of healing arises from within us. You know, if I compare indigestion, for example, not that I get it, but if you compared that to someone being insulted or offended by something I've said, or if I've sprained an ankle or lost a dear loved one, my body and mind has somehow suffered a blow, big or small, and then it tries to regain a sense of wholeness. I'm sure every single one of you sitting around here would have your own experience of that. Now I just have to find out, have I gone past a picture that says I am whole? No. Okay, sorry, I haven't been keeping up. Oh, there we go. This little poem is written by Rachel Naomi Remen. She is a medical doctor from the States, and she lives with Crohn's disease, and she now runs programs for medical doctors to support this inherent nature of healing and to companion people. So she has lived with Crohn's disease for a long time, and her poem, I just thought, captured it. Oh Body, she's talking about her body, for 35 years, 1,573 experts with 14,372 combined years of training have failed to cure my wounds or your wounds, but deep inside I am whole. So she lives with this Crohn's disease. And not only has she responded to the medical profession or to her own needs, she's responded to the medical profession by setting up a program to support medical doctors. And people from Australia go overseas to her centre to touch the hearts of patients. It's very interesting now being in a hospital. I see a lot of young medical students. They walk around with their stethoscopes around their necks. And, you know, the life experience is perhaps, you can't teach people that. They have to gain it themselves. But that's the heart of it, is what's missing for some. So healing, whether physical or psychological, needs to be eased and supported. And often in our Western culture, we do everything we can to hurry it up, to increase our capacity to heal, take medication, stress and have negative thoughts about what's going on. Soldier on with Codral would be the classic example. Why doesn't it say stop, rest, relax, stop, revive, thrive, all of those sorts of things? But no, on the other hand, most of the medication is around to get rid of the symptoms that are uncomfortable and provide us with discomfort. For full healing, a deep regeneration and a radical change is what fills us with vitality and well-being and joy. So this process never ceases to amaze me, and even more so in this job, I'm being more amazed on a daily basis. The other thing that Rachel Naomi Remen has written about her institute, this is the place she has set up. She's talking about the institute as in a place of stillness. The one who thinks hears the whisper of the heart. In a place of trust, the one who cures heals. So talking to medical practitioners. In a place of acceptance, a stone can explode into a butterfly. So the possibility is endless. So something that's heart of heart, as we know in Scripture, can go from stone to a beautiful heart of love. So disease she sees as a spiritual path. Yes, so it's very much so that illness in a way could be the cause of, in our Western society, particularly the loss of the soul. That's something that she purports. So that's just by way of a little bit of background as to, a bit about healing and curing and wholeness, and a little bit of the journey I've experienced to date. But I wanted to take you on a bit of a journey reflecting on two passages of Scripture. One I'm going to reflect on, and one I've invited Phil to share with you as well. And the paper that I'm drawing from, I've given you and Alison's kindly photocopies from Jerry Arbuckle. The healing ministry of Jesus, as I said, is the central focus of Catholic healthcare. And at the heart of this is the Good Samaritan story, as told in Luke 10:29-37. And it's Jesus' response to the question put to him, who is my neighbour? But keeping in mind, even though we're focusing on two scripture passages today, more broadly, however, Jesus constantly responded to the needs of those who desired to be healed. The healing was profound, and the power of forgiveness, and yes, healing, like of the leper, the blind, the infirmed. The healing was really about them being re-engaged in their community. The healing was from isolation to inclusion, from exclusion to community, to integration and wholeness, really complete transformation. So the healing was sort of bringing back to communio, bringing back to being part of the body of Christ, if you like. It's interesting that even Princess Diana, when she was around, had said once that nothing so fragments the human spirit than isolation. So in fact, when you look at a lot of the healing stories in Scripture, Jesus is really bringing people back into their communities, as the lepers had to live outside of their communities. When there was all the blood and impurities, people couldn't be part of the community, they were ostracised. So the healing was about inclusion, about belonging, about acceptance. So while I'll focus now on the Good Samaritan story, and a lot of my words are actually taken from Jerry's work, but they really had restored hope, I think, then, about that capacity to be part of community. And yes, their physical ailments may very well have gone away, but the greater healing was about them belonging. So in the opinion of the late Pope John Paul II, the parable of the Good Samaritan articulates the heart of healthcare, mission and ministry of Jesus, and that is the Good Samaritan. He stated that all those involved professionally or voluntarily in the world of health are invited to fix their gaze, got a beautiful statement, fix their gaze on the Divine Samaritan. And in Pope Benedict's first encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, there's at least 4 times when he relates to the parable of the Good Samaritan as the model of holistic care. So Jerry Arbuckle is Amara's father, and he's played a pivotal role both in Australia and at the international levels around looking at the Catholic identity of Catholic healthcare. And the essence, I think, of the Good Samaritan story he picks up, so it's in the article that you've got there, but he speaks of 6 levels of violence in the story of the Good Samaritan. And these are just 3 different images that I came across of Samaritan. I think Good Samaritan story, I think the artwork is quite profound, really, because it can actually pick up on some of the essence of what the story's about. And the more colourful one on the bottom right, I think, captures the essence more of the story. And just chatting to Alison before, she was saying she's actually been to this place, like it's right smack bang, she said, bang between Jerusalem and Jericho, very isolated, desolate place. So imagine this incident if it happened right at this time. So Jesus is emphasising the fact, complete isolation, where this incident had taken place, quite desolate place. So the 6 levels of violence that Jerry talks about has to do with the verbal violence of the Torah scholar, the religious lawyer challenging Jesus in a very public and a probably aggressive way. The physical violence related to the assault of the bandits on an innocent man. Ritual violence in the sense of the victim being covered in blood and being impure and unclean. And social in the sense of the man being completely stripped of his clothes and being shamed and humiliated. The racial violence in the sense of the priest and the Levite, who allegedly should have been the 2 pillars of biblical Jewish culture and were quite fundamental for their time, when their Israelite tradition would have required them to be compassionate to the poor and marginalised, and both of them walked the other way. The other sort of violence he talked about was occupational violence, that there was a lot of prejudice and discrimination at the time, particularly around the traders of oil and wine, which would have been what the Samaritan would have been involved in, and that profession was quite stigmatised in that there were apparently a lot of shady deals going on at the time. So he's obviously done some research around that. I wasn't aware, so I've learnt some things. So then he moves on to the Samaritan's qualities. So looking at, get this worked out yet, Phil. 6 truths as a part of this story. And I'm not going to go into all of them because you've got the article there to read. The 2 I was keen to talk about really were the last 2, particularly more about the holistic and the prophetic role. So they're outlined very much in his article. So creating a gift from God, stewardship, etc., community. The holistic healing, I think, really fits in with what I've been speaking about already, but also in the article, Jerry speaks of John Paul II, saying that the parable not only spurs one on to help the sick, but also to do what one can to integrate them into society. And I think that picks up on the whole notion of advocacy, that in a way for Catholic healthcare it's just not enough to respond to the needs of the sick, that in fact it's the changing of the structures in society that actually perpetuate the fact that there's homelessness, perpetuate the fact that there's a huge gap between Indigenous life expectancy and our own. So that's the other side of it. So the holistic healing and the prophetic role that could be played is really important. And to finish off, in that article, Jerry actually has it nearly like a wanted sign, a wanted poster. If you want to work in Catholic healthcare, you're wanted if you really, like St. Bonaventure, wrote that the Samaritan poured into the wounds of the half-dead wanderer the wine of fervent zeal and the oil of compassion. So that's exactly what he thinks in healthcare that we need, with people with fervent zeal and to follow Jesus and be able to be retellers of the story of the Good Samaritan. So it looks like prophets are wanted. So if you want a new job, come and work at St. Vincent's. So I'm just going to invite Phil, because Phil having worked together, has shared some lovely insights on the reflection on the woman who's had a hemorrhage for, 12 years, and then juxtaposed with the story of Jairus' daughter. So this is an image I found, Phil, but it might not capture the essence of where you want to go with it, but there we
Thanks, Julie. I feel a bit guilty taking your time.
Not at all.
I'll be brief. And I haven't got a copy of the story, but I probably rely on you to, you'll know the story well. The Jairus, the Roman official, comes to Jesus, "My daughter's dying, please come." And he's on his way to visit the 12-year-old girl who's dying. And the woman who's had the hemorrhage for 12 years steps out of the crowd, comes up behind Jesus and touches him. And immediately Jesus, feeling power go out of him, turns around and says, "Who touched me?" And his disciples says, "Don't be stupid. There's people pressing in all around you. What do you mean, who touched you? Everybody's touched you." He says, "No, who touched me?" And eventually the woman, in fear and trembling, comes forward, "It was I." And the story says, most translations in Mark's thing will say, she fell at his feet and Jesus spoke to her and said, "Your faith has saved you, go." And the bleeding stopped at that moment and she went off. The other translation of that, rather than falling at her feet, it can equally be she embraced him, and the same then interaction takes place. Jesus then, having that little story interludes, he then continues on his way to the 12-year-old girl, goes into the house. So he said, "Look, she's died already." He says, "No, she's not dead, she's sleeping. Get out of the way. Peter, James and John, come with me." So when Peter and James and John are there, something important's going to happen. He goes in, takes the little girl's hand and says, "Father, whatever, stand up." The girl stands up and he says, "Give her something to eat." Diakonia, let's join in table fellowship. Now, you can read that story as a little video clip in the day in the life of Jesus. He's on the way, he's Roman official, girl's sick, on his way, woman steps out. So, it takes 2 minutes on the news at night, and flick and we get on to the next, what's going to happen tomorrow. The story, as Brian showed us this morning, I think has got profound meaning, and there's much more you can say about it. And if I can just share a couple of things, and I won't delay a whole lot of time on it, but if you think about the story, that the two women, the 12-year-old and the woman with the hemorrhage, it's a deliberately constructed story, isn't it? It's not just two separate incidents, one occurring in the other, within the text of Mark. You've got the number 12 twice. You've got a woman who's bleeding for 12 years, the adult, and a 12-year-old girl. And so the author of the Gospel, obviously, I think, and scholars who read around this, several people work in the same way with this text, say there's a connection between the two women. And we're meant to say, and start to draw connections about what's happened here. So let's go with the older woman first, the adult woman. She's had this affliction for 12 years of bleeding that wouldn't stop. She's been to all the doctors. She's spent every penny she's had, and she's still not healed. No, she's still not cured. She's still, in Julie's terms, she's still not cured. The bleeding persisted. What do we know about women who were bleeding in this culture? They're isolated. Okay? Women during their menstrual cycle, every month, they isolated themselves. They lived in exclusion, all social, all religious, all everything. They were not allowed to partake in the religious, social, economic life until that period was over, and then they'd go through a ritual cleansing and then were able to rejoin society. Same with anybody who come in touch with blood, anybody who come in touch with a dead person, they had to go through this ritual cleansing. Women, by the mere fact of being women, were socially excluded for that time. There's a wonderful book, Monica Diamond, The Red Tent, if you haven't read it, which just develops that whole theme and that whole story. It's a beautiful text. So this woman had been afflicted for 12 years. She represents, if you like, what it was to be woman in that culture, and exaggerated, not just for a week or 8 or 9 days, but for 12 long years. It's a lifetime she's been afflicted. She bleeds continually. What she does then, what does she do? She breaks the taboo of society that kept her excluded. She comes into public. She should not have been there. She should not have been anywhere near Jesus. She should not have been in the crowd. And the story is she comes up behind Jesus. Some commentators, she comes up behind Jesus because he cannot see her. Even if she was in front of him, she can't see her, because as a male, you've got to get some images around who Jesus was. Perhaps work with that in your mind as well here, because he's going to grow through this experience. Jesus himself grows and learns something. And there's several other stories in the Gospel where this happens. She comes up behind, he can't see her because as a male in that culture can't see her woman who's bleeding. Just can't. You're not allowed to be in touch. She touches him and he says he felt the power go out of him. What power went out of him? Those who have a certain image of Jesus, well, it was a healing power. Of course, he felt all this energy flow out of him that made the woman's, maybe, possibly, and very possible. But also, another power that went out of him was the power of male dominance in that culture. The beauty of Jesus in this story, whatever about whether the bleeding stopped or not, the beauty of Jesus in this culture was he had to identify this woman, he turned and faced her and they embraced. He did not allow all of those taboos around blood and bleeding, etc., to stand in his way of meeting in Tony's things one face to face. They embraced. And in that act, both healing and curing take place. Okay, the woman is rescued from the role of having to be isolated. She's been accepted by a male in a very, very public way. The taboo's broken. No longer will women need to be excluded in the communities that gather around Jesus because they happen to bleed. The story continues. Jesus then goes on his way to the official's daughter, Jairus' daughter. How old is she? She's 12 years old. What do we know about 12 years old? In that culture, she is of marriageable age. It's shocking for us, but 12 years, she's of marriageable age. She's just beginning the cycle that this woman has just been healed of. She's beginning the cycle where she will be excluded. Jesus, having had the encounter with the adult woman, is now able to go to this 12-year-old girl and say, stand up, come. She's not dead, because death, like blood, the bleeding thing is a symbolic thing. To be bleeding it's a symbol of death. And so the woman for that period every month was dead politically, socially, religiously. He goes to the 12-year-old girl and said, you will no longer be afflicted by this cultural isolation. Stand up, come, give her something to eat, diakonia. She's to be included in the table fellowship, even though she's menstrual. So, yes, I think it's a good example of a story that has that healing element and the curing element. But the healing is much more important because it's about overcoming the isolation, the isolation that is inflicted by cultural norms and cultural taboos. And so what the story demonstrates, if you like, is what life in the kingdom of God should be like and what it ought to be like for all women, but hence then for anybody who's marginalised. There is to be no pushing aside. Nothing should keep somebody from being brought into communion.
It was worth having him do it, wasn't it? It's very interesting, having been in healthcare where the Good Samaritan story is the story that's pretty well told all the time and it's related to men. I often tell Phil's version of that so that people go, oh, women, you know, yes, there's healing stories around women as well, because it's very interesting too in a hospital environment compared to a school environment, even though it's a Catholic hospital. Very few people are Catholic. Very few people have any sort of religious affiliation at all. And I know some of our secondary schools, we have a proportion of staff who may not be Catholic as well, but it's easier for them to be integrated into the life of the school because it's a community that worships and prays, and we try to do that in hospital. When you've got 2,000 people, staff that is, let alone patients, it's actually more problematic. So they were just two examples. The Good Samaritan, I suppose, as the keystone story for Catholic healthcare, and I really just appreciated Phil sharing his reflections on the woman with the hemorrhage. My goodness, and Jairus' daughter. It's interesting when you look at artwork because they take everything so literally. So when Phil was, when I looked at both of those images, I thought we look at the literal interpretation, but the figurative interpretation or the actual metaphoric interpretation is again so different. So you would assume by this picture and every other picture that I saw around Jairus' daughter, she was dead. Something that the artwork doesn't seem to capture necessarily what the essence of what we were just sharing. So I was keen to move on really now to look at this from a spirituality of the heart perspective and see this sort of transformative journey as a journey of the heart or to the heart, and definitely in pursuit of wholeness. In your readings, we have got the booklet. There's a very short article that James wrote called The Way of the Heart, and it really captures the essence, I suppose, quite succinctly of some of the areas that we identified, particularly in our work in the Institute, to say what is spirituality of the heart about, and there's 5 areas that we've looked at. And the first one was around the Sacred Heart communicates firstly and foremost a love of God, or the love of God and a loving God. So that love is foundational in a spirituality of the heart. So I'm just going to outline these and stick on the last one because that has to do with woundedness and transformation. The second one is still there, is that saying that a spirituality of the heart places the joys and difficulties of relationships at the core of the spiritual journey, and in fact saying that relationships are a spiritual practice, if you like. Most of us live our life in relationship. We don't live in isolation, as we've said. And that in fact being isolated is nearly like one of the worst punishments you could ever offer anyone. If you talk to people that work in prisons, if they say to people what's the worst punishment apart from being in prison, is they hate isolation. If they're off to isolation cells, it's the worst thing you could do to a human being is to isolate them. So we recognise that in a spirituality of the heart, that our interconnectedness, our quality of our relationships give expressions to a spirituality of the heart. The third area that is outlined in that little brief article is that a spirituality of the heart, or the Sacred Heart, calls us to live from a deep inner spring, that it does have a contemplative dimension, that it's about a going in and connecting with our own hearts, as Kelly outlined. We then connect with the hearts of others in that process, but it really is about somehow making sure we have prayerful and reflective practices that take us into our own heart. The fact that it's an embodied spirituality, you can't have a spirituality without being lived in a lifestyle, really. So just saying that it points to the flesh and blood reality of our everyday lives, and this is the place of divine revelation, and we can't forget that, because it really is in every opportunity where we can encounter the divine, in the sacredness of everything that happens in our own lives, that it's definitely embodied and holistic. And leading on then to the main area that I wanted to focus on, which was this one, is to say that the Sacred Heart portrays Jesus' woundedness, his woundedness, as the source of new life for all. We are encouraged to accept our own woundedness and to realise that our woundedness can be the place of transformation. So very simply put, that a spirituality of the heart is a transformative journey. Wendy Wright has written a little book that some of you may have managed to get your hands on called Sacred Heart Gateway to the Divine, and she comes from a Salesian background, but they're very much embedded in the heart tradition as well, in the French spiritualities, but saying that the Sacred Heart tradition holds at its core the stunning insight of Christianity that the divine is revealed in the specific, embodied persons and events of our lives. Now, for a lot of people, that takes a bit of time to get used to. If you've come from a very traditional understanding of how you encounter God, is it just in religious and ritual practice that happens? Is it just in prayer? Is it not in the living of our everyday life? Seeing ourselves as inherently good, or seeing that we are divine beings, that God actually, we might have used the words to, there's great songs that the kids used to sing, Jesus lives in your heart, and that God dwells within us, God is dwelling in our heart, that sort of thing, but in fact we don't really believe it. How could we be divine beings? But if we're supposed to reflect God's image and likeness, then in fact we have to grow in our understanding and acceptance of that. So it's definitely, in terms of a spirituality of the heart, in our everyday life and experience that we encounter God, and that's where God is revealed. A story I heard once from Richard Rohr, if any of you are Richard Rohr fans, he talks about a woman called Paula Darcy, and she said once that God comes to you disguised as your life. And in 1970, Paula and her family were in a horrendous car accident in which her husband, her daughter were killed outright. She was pregnant at the time. The baby in utero survived but had life-threatening and lifelong injuries. She was cast on a profound journey, and she's obviously connected with Richard and been able to continue now to be a great storyteller, if you like, of this journey and of hope and of healing. Because over time she's been able to integrate the experience and all that happened to her in a way that still has given her faith and hope and belief in a God that's with you in the mess, not causing it, which a lot of people struggle with. It's not my secretary, but I share a room with my boss's secretary, and she's lost her partner this year. And she came in one day, this about 2 weeks ago, and this is her second partner. She's only in her 40s. Both have died at different times, and it's just been unbelievable. And she came in one day. Her dog had actually been attacked as they were walking, and she just lost it. I hadn't seen her as upset even when her partner died. She came in and was sobbing and sobbing and sobbing, and it was like, what, it was really that why is me. Finally, it got to her where she said, there's only so much a person can take. What's God doing to me? And so it's the big questions. And it was really, the dog was very symbolic. She was powerless, as she was with her two partners who were, travelling with terminal illnesses, which is just amazing. You would think, if you had to ask the question, why would God do that? I don't think there's an answer. And maybe we should stop asking the question, because she really was struggling this day. And I said, I don't think God's out to get you. And then people come out with the platitudes like, oh, well, that God doesn't give you anything you can't handle. That'll get you through that little pep talk. All I could do was be with her. I'm behind my computer trying to work, getting ready for something, and I just had to stop. Just had to stop and be with her. Now, you couldn't meet a bigger-hearted woman than this woman, and she's larger than life, and here she is just grieving, desperately grieving, and thinking, what else can happen? I don't have the resources to deal with this. And she's exhausted, emotionally, spiritually, everything exhausted, and trying to make sense of where's God in this for her. And I think Paula Darcy was trying to make the same sense. How does a loving God, that's what the challenge is, how does a loving God allow bad things to happen? I think I at least said, bad things happen to good people, it's not up to God who's chosen to get the tough stuff. We all get it in different ways at different times. So I suppose really what we're moving into now with this is like talking about the conversion of heart experiences, that metanoia, that Greek word that says, we're literally going beyond mind and sometimes beyond heart to even grasp some understanding of the how and why of all of this is, and how we can live in the mystery of pain and suffering. I've got another girlfriend who's she's very spiritual and very beautiful, and she just says, she's watched a friend of hers die from a horrendous melanoma experience, and she just said, she didn't deserve that. Well, I don't think anyone deserves their physical suffering, and she didn't deserve it, but it is what it is. It actually is what being human is, that in fact we are predisposed to illness and ailments, and bad things happen. I literally say, having journeyed with families as a principal where kids died, and just sort of thought, an 8-year-old or less, or babies, and you just think, from the minute you're conceived, you can die. And in our Western world, we don't seem to have a concept of that very easily. And I've picked it up in the medical field too, or even when my own dad was dying, I thought, when are they going to talk to us? I could see he wasn't well. When are they going to talk to us about palliative care, rather than intervening and chopping up his second leg, So he made the choice. So I think there really is a struggle in Western society, and I've talked to the director of the hospice, Dr. Richard Chai, to say, are the medical profession actually, like doctors particularly, trained to keep actively treating, or when do you have the conversation about dying in dignity, or supporting people in their dying journey? I think it's a real challenge in our Western world. So I think the deeper questions are really around this change of heart stuff, that in fact, how, when you're in the depths of despair, of grief, of loss, do you make any sense of that, and how do you move through it? Somehow magically we do. As human beings, we have an amazing capacity for resilience. We may need support and encouragement along the way, but Paula Darcy somehow managed to do that because she's gone on to write and to lecture and to support people on that journey. That's not going anywhere. Lunig's a big fan, or I'm a big fan of Lunig's, I should say. We've got a guy at work whose surname is spelled the same, but he doesn't pronounce it the same, so I get very upset. I go, hi Peter Lunig, oh, Leinig. So he doesn't like getting called Peter Lunig. But you know, the old concept of being on journey, being a pilgrim, is exactly really what the spiritual journey is about. It's a metaphor, you know, for us of our spiritual life. And there's lots of literature. This has stopped working for some reason. We're back to, you know, having ladders to climb. If you've read any you know, spiritual literature about the spiritual journey, that we talk about ladders to climb, mountains to ascend, there's deserts to cross, and then there's holy places to visit. And all of those things are part of what can be part of our spiritual journey, and that's certainly a holy place. I've been to Iona off the island, you know, the island of Scotland, and I think people do, you know, travel these journeys sometimes by choice, and sometimes not by choice. They're thrown onto them. Some things cast us on these journeys, and we are encouraged by John and God's statement to say, do not be afraid, you know, I'm with you through this. And I think if I think of my colleague there the other day, she was just going, what else could be thrown my way? I just don't have the inner resources to deal with this. So she sobbed and sobbed for quite a few days after that. So in the heart tradition, we pretty well, as we have done in Chevalier Institute, use that symbol to reflect the journey to the heart. It's an inward journey, it's an outward journey. If you've ever walked a labyrinth, that's not quite a labyrinth, it's more of a spiral, but the labyrinth actually you get close to the centre and then you're out again on the fringes. So that probably in a way reflects more the journey of our life. Our group were out at Hawken Hills last week with the Sisters of St Joseph, and they have a massive labyrinth. It nearly, like, to do and walk it reflectively took about half an hour for the group, minimum, for that to happen. And you know, at one stage you've got people right close to the centre, and then others are right on the periphery. And I thought that really does reflect this concept of the journey to our own heart. Sometimes we've really got it together, we're integrated, we sort of feel comfortable in our skin. And there are other times where you just think, I haven't got a clue what's going on, and I'm right on the fringes, and I'm on the edge at times, and sometimes right on the edge. So I think our logo resonated for a lot of people. And then we moved to, you might have on your sheet the definition of the spirituality of the heart. I seem to have gone from something's missing and not here, so I don't know why. But a definition that we used basically around the spirituality of the heart, saying that it reverences the human heart as being loved unconditionally by God, which I spoke about before, about that journey into your own heart and then a movement out. So it's just not an inward gazing exercise. I suppose it's like we are called to be on mission, that we are nourished in our own heart, and then we're called to go out. But in fact, it's the encounter of the heart of Jesus that's really has the power to turn brokenness into a blessing. And I know Chris Chaplin, MSc, has used these 4 words to describe that movement. So we've got Kat Skelly's 4 movements, but I've also heard Chris speak about these, saying, you know, it's about an encounter, about intimacy with Jesus, it's about a conversion experience, and then it's an action out. So this is really that sort of the cyclic nature, if you like, of the living of a spirituality of the heart. And good old St Augustine really tells us the same thing, that his expression of it is that we're on a journey, and we're not settled really until we're comfortable in our relationship with God, that we keep searching. And I don't know whether we ever arrive there. There are times we think we get there, but we're still always on that journey. So if I think back to Paula Darcy and her life story, I don't really know much about her other than her sharing that story. But each of us sitting around the room would have our own story about loss and grief and whatever's cast you on the profound search. And I remember the year that my dad died, I took myself off to Petrea King Centre at Bundanoon. So if any of you know it, she does a lot of work with cancer sufferers and really supporting them on their healing journey. I'd say probably more women would go there than men, but there's different programs for different people. And I sat in a semicircle like this, and I'd gone mainly because of the loss of Dad, and it wasn't particularly related to illness. And we went around the room saying why people had come, and the first woman said, my husband, walked out, and my 14-year-old's a drug addict, so that was one. And I'm sitting there going, no, Dad's death doesn't sound so bad. The next person said something like, my house burnt down last year, and my 2-year-old son burnt to death. This is getting better by the minute. So it honestly went around, and people's life experience just blew me out of the water. Another woman said, these were mainly women, there was 2 men in our group, another woman had said that her brother-in-law had shot her sister and her father. And I was just going like, you've got to be joking. I've come on this program and hear all these people, and got to the point where Petrea just went, it's not a competition. Our life story is, we were feeling quite challenged by hearing the depth of pain and the depth of experience that all these people were coming to be healed from, or getting support to be healed from. So in the end, I thought, Dad's death was real for me, and the loss and the grief was very profound. But it seemed to be, and I say this to people all the time, your stuff's your stuff. The only way that you can go through it is through your own journey. But you can't help sometimes but be overwhelmed by other things that you hear about that happen to other people. So it isn't a competition, but we certainly have to find a way forward. But it's definitely the most painful things that happen in our life that break us, but also give us the opportunity for regrowth. So unless, I heard someone say to me once that our hearts are open because they are broken. So if our hearts are open because they are broken, then the healing can happen. So the Sacred Heart, particularly the Sacred Heart, portrays Jesus' woundedness as the source of new life for all. We are encouraged to accept our own woundedness and to realise that this point of woundedness is the point of transformation. Now, if we actually physically look at the images of the Sacred Heart, beautiful, your first communion card, everyone got one? Or if we take a closer look at the actual image, the wound is part of this image, this mythology that we've built up. And I don't know if John Raitt talked about the transition of the woundedness, like the celebration, or they used to celebrate the Feast of the Five Wounds. Did he talk about that? No. Bernard of Clairvaux, I think that's right, where in about the 1100s, they used to celebrate the Feast of the Five Wounds of Jesus. So the wound in the side, the pierced, all we've got in Scripture is that Jesus' side was pierced. So that's the origin of the Sacred Heart, and the heart being pierced developed over time. So it went from the Feast of the Five Wounds to then the Feast of the Sacred Heart, where the thing was that the wound in the side became the access to the heart, this very symbolic place of our being, the core of our being, and the core of Jesus' being, if you like. So the heart is always represented with a wound, and also with the crown of thorns and flames and all sorts of. So there we go. There's a range of images, not to scare you, but to just say this is part of our tradition that we've come from. At Sacred Heart Hospice at Darlinghurst, we're very fortunate to have one of the green Jesuses from World Youth Day. If any of you were around Sydney at the time, there was an art competition and people painted images that were of Jesus, the Sacred Heart, and they were all different styles. So for some reason we've got this green Jesus. He's not the most attractive, but it's exactly that white statue but painted green. So I think he scares some of the preachers around the place, and people just go, why have you got a green Jesus? Like they really, it was a bit off colour that day, I don't know what he ate. But, and another friend who, because they auctioned them off after World Youth Day, there were all these, and there was a yellow Jesus, And friends of mine from Des Moines, when I worked there, they bought the yellow Jesus and put it in their backyard, but their dog went ballistic, and so they had to actually get rid of it so their dog wouldn't cope with the yellow Jesus. So look, it's I find to me it's the most powerful symbol, that this Sacred Heart. People don't necessarily relate to the images, and I'm finding that, like, I just thought, oh, how beautiful to be able to celebrate Sacred Heart Feast Day this year with a place that's called Sacred Heart. And they're looking at me like, you know, they really didn't quite get it. But anyway, I just said it's a feast of love. You know, it's a feast, celebration of love, and a companioning of life's journey and the tough stuff. So that's how I see it. But anyway, not everyone sees it the same way as me. But the reality really is around our woundedness here, and our fragility and our vulnerability as human beings. And I think a spirituality of the heart recognises that we've all got wounded hearts. We don't necessarily share them with everybody. Not everyone would know that we've got our own wounds, but they definitely are the place of transformation. The other image that comes from the tradition quite strongly, actually we sometimes overlook that it actually is from John 7:37, that one of the foundational scriptural texts for spirituality of the heart is this one, that says, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me, and let the one who believes in me drink. As the scripture has said, out of the believer's heart shall flow rivers of living water." So that was the New Revised Standard Version, but the Jerusalem text is this: "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me, let anyone who believes in me come and drink. As the scripture has said, from his heart shall flow streams of living water." So the water, not only when we look at it sacramentally as sort of Eucharist, but is actually this new life and the transformation dimension that we sometimes overlook in our tradition. That in fact the new life comes from the wounded heart. And if you look at it from here, it's like, this is the one that's on the front of this, the Salesian book, but it's, you know, the water's pouring forth. You know, it's like a fountain of new life, and it is from the wounds that is possible. So I think symbolically, again, our tradition is very rich in giving us a way forward to say that there's hope. There's hope for new life, even if we're dying. You know, even if we're not going to be cured for this thing that we're experiencing. Just another image. Pick on the images. But I think that's the other beauty of our tradition, is actually it's rich in imagery and symbol. Now, if I just go on to the work of Elizabeth Kane, who says that we are cast on the spiritual journey. This is like the journey of transformation because of these things: grief, loss, dislocation, what else has she got? Disillusionment, illness. I don't know if you've ever been in a position where you've lost a job, or been moved or transferred and you didn't want to be. All of those things can disconnect people from their life. And all people that have worked overseas or lived overseas, you can only see how their hearts get low, and they get stressed and anxious about life because it's not the way it's used to be. Change schools, looking at people around the room, or move north and come back, you know. So all of these things that happen in our lives can send us on a bit of a journey and say, what is it that we're on about? What do we want to be on about? How do we get back on track with it all? So that's Elizabeth Kane's work. It's really based on sort of that Freudian and Jungian thing of wounding of the ego. And then other people like David Ransom would just say that it's at any moment of deep wonder or delight, a time of great crisis of transition, or when our experience of limit has happened. And that's when we're also cast on the journey. So it's not just about the tough stuff. People would say the other most profound transformational experience in their life would be the birth of a child or falling in love. So the things that lift and elevate your spirit to a way of being that's sort of beyond anything you've ever encountered before. So in pain, in suffering, but in joy, in delight and wonder as well. So all of those things really connect in with a transformative journey too. So here we have another Lunic, not a Leinig, a Lunic. Yeah, Lunic always has just a little bit of extra weight, you know. And as you're carrying your cross, have time to smell the roses or the flowers, and don't mind, carry the bird with you. And people like Eckhart Tolle, who's written The Power of Now, says, you know, if anything bad happens in your life, use it for enlightenment. It's you know, he's like the new mystical person that people seem to be relating to in the New Earth he's written, and Power of the Present Moment, etc. But he, you know, if anything bad happens, use it for enlightenment. And Michael Whelan, is he Morris? Yes. He talks about the bad stuff being that we all carry a backpack. If you haven't heard his backpack story, you all carry a backpack, and anything bad that happens, you know, well, I'm going to say the word shit because he says shit. He says put your shit in your backpack, you know, and so you're carrying it around, and he says then when you get to the checkout one day and someone's cut in front of you, he said you bend down to pick up your groceries, the shit comes all over you, it's on the ground, and then he said you'll see someone else do something and you'll pick a bit up and chuck it at them, and he said basically we've got to integrate and compost our shit. Because if we don't compost it, that's what's going to happen. That we're going to fly off the handle and throw bits of it at people and or dwell in it ourselves. So in terms of transformation, that's also the key, is the integration of the tough stuff. Now, there's no magic formula. I wish I could stand up here and say the curing part, it's really easy. You just do this, this and this and you're going to feel all better. But it isn't like that. We all know it's not like that. But it is about integration. If nothing else, it's about trying to make sense and meaning of what has happened to you in your life. But composting is not a bad thing. Composting your own stuff. Oh, the other thing that Eckhart Tolle says, he says enlightenment through suffering, as he sees it, like the way of the cross. You know, we talk about the way of the cross and everyone carrying a cross. He says it means to be forced into the kingdom of heaven, kicking and screaming. So it means you're going to fight it on the way and trying to make sense of it. The other thing we do in our tradition, I've done him, is that every year we have the cycle. We have Lent. We have the Lent Easter. We're reminded very much every year of the Paschal mystery, the death, resurrection of Jesus. So annually we're reminded of that cycle. But if I was looking at someone's life, it's a little bit more like this. We've got all these, death, resurrection things happening all over the place in our life. That it's death is only healed by rebirth. A thorough renewal. After sorrow and despair have ruled, somehow vitality and life turn up. And if you've ever read the book Tuesdays with Morrie, have any of you read the Mitch Albom book? He says things like, when we learn how to die, we learn how to live. So that's a pretty profound thing. That it's, if he said, we're talking about the little bird on the cross of Leunig, he says, you have a little bird on your shoulder, and every morning you say, is it okay today if I die? So if I died today, would it be okay? So if it's not okay, what do you need to do today for it to be okay? Is there someone you need to be in right relationship? Is there someone you need to reconnect with? Is there something that needs to be said, something you need to do for yourself? So in a way, some of this comes from a Buddhist tradition, because that's where he and Eckhart Tolle and others have come from. But just this little reminder to say, is it okay today? If today was it, is it okay? If it's not, then what do we need? What do you need to do about it? So that's just have a little bird on your shoulder in the morning. The other thing that has come through, and it's in one of your readings, I'll just see if I can find it. I'll find it in a moment. But this is, there we go, it's the Richard Byrne reading, book reading 3.5 in your book. And he's talking about journey. You don't have to look at it now, but just so you know the connection, but journey, growth and development, that we do go along in life feeling securely oriented. And that for some reason, that painful disorientation comes, and it might come through all those things that we just talked about, grief, loss, dislocation, anything else that happens. Tough stuff happens in life, so that's what sends us off. And then somehow, it's not magic, but there's a time when it does come when you go, surprisingly, you're reoriented. You feel on track. Now, if I was completely honest with you and open, my journey to this new job was one of the most painful things in my life, deciding to leave Chevalier Institute. I grieved and groaned and knew in my heart that I had to do something. Not because I didn't want to change the job, I just couldn't travel. I ran into Tim Brennan only last week, believe it or not, and I said, Tim, you should have brought all the MSc schools together and all the MSc parishes together in Sydney, and I would have been very happy. For me, it was just the travel. And it was exhausting. So the sense that I'm in an exhausting job at the moment, but I go to the one place every day, seems to sustain me a little bit better. and building community. The fact that there's some fantastic people here that I've connected with in the past is beautiful. But to have people there daily, for those of you that work in community-based things, that you've got connections, and it's really important to people. But I agonised over it, and I'd still say I grieved even in the new role, but it got too busy for me to grieve for too long. So I ended up with 2.5 jobs in a very quick amount of time. But so it is this, and I would say I'm 12 months in and feeling surprisingly, probably in the last month, surprisingly reoriented for some reason. So I can't say what magically happened for that to happen, but it started to feel good and okay, and starting to feel a lot happier and noticing a difference and people knowing you, and so these are just things to notice for yourselves in these sorts of things. Another image about woundedness. Another Lunic. So I was just also thinking too that it really is how we handle the tough stuff in life that is the cornerstone or the hallmark of who we are. I know people where some tough stuff has happened to them, but they're very bitter and twisted. Have you come across people like that? It's very hard to be with them because nothing's good, nothing's ever hopeful. And I feel like they just dig a spiral, and you can see them getting lower and lower and lower. And then there are other people that go, yeah, tough stuff happens, but I will integrate it, and I long for life and energy. So I think that's the challenge. And I think when I was doing this a few years ago, I wrote down here Sophie Delezio's parents. Do you remember that little girl who was a horrendous accident? Then she got run over again. And there are her family on the news, and here's this little girl just making the most of life. This is the tough stuff life has dealt me, but we're going to respond positively. So I think that's what we're being called to in this. I'll just read you the Lunic's poem to this. It's called Air in the Heart. When the heart is cracked or broken, do not clutch it. Let the wound lie open. Let the wind from the good sea blow in to bathe the wound with salt and let it sting. I didn't particularly like this bit. It says, let a stray dog lick it. Let a bird lean in the hole and sing a simple song like a tiny bell and let it ring. So that's what I think we've got to do with our woundedness. Sometimes we don't like to leave our wounds open. We don't know how to stay in our woundedness because we do want the pill that's going to take the pain away. The challenge. Again, no easy answers. So just going back to perhaps landing this or grounding this in the tradition, Karl Rahner was one of the main reinterpreters of the heart tradition, and he basically said, in death his sacred heart, meaning Jesus, has become the pulse of the innermost heart of the world, and down here, the earth, in her continual development in space and time, sinks her roots into the power of Almighty God. Now, that might not make a lot of sense to you, but I think Karl Rahner there is really just trying to connect with the sense of the heart being at the core, and that sacred heart of Jesus actually being there, and that potential for regrowth from the core of our universe. And then another one of his around this, that life is an ongoing journey from woundedness to wholeness. It's the path of unity. And Lunig also finishes, and I'll finish there for now, with the piercing of the side, the flowing of living water, but the sacramentality of Eucharist, etc., coming from there. So for a little while, I'm just going to break. It's been a long time you've been sitting and listening, so have a chat with someone next to you about any questions you might have or comments you'd like to make. So take about 3 minutes, 5 minutes to have a bit of a conversation with somebody close by.